So first, before I get started, I'm sure everybody in this room has heard of these two things, but I did want to ask, how many of you have heard of SBOMs? Okay, how many of you actually use them? That's what I thought. Now, when I gave it this talk, or a very similar talk in Australia, when I asked the first question, one person raised their hand, and absolutely nobody used SBOMs, which was actually a little bit surprising to me. But I learned a lot on that trip, actually related to how Australia handles their cybersecurity and differences between the US and Australia, which I won't get into, but I just thought it was an interesting difference there. Okay, so why we're here. Vulnerabilities nowadays in cybersecurity are being introduced far left of effect and at scale. So with supply chain compromises, we see a compromise or vulnerability being introduced far deep into the supply chain, and the ultimate effect comes way later when companies, organizations, teams take software or code, implement it into their workflows, and then all of a sudden this vulnerability happens. We've seen these a few times. I'm sure all of us are in the room are familiar with some of these. Here's the definition from CISA of what a supply chain attack is. Some notable ones, NotPetya, kinda, Log4j, SolarWinds. We're all kind of familiar with these. But with AI and a lot of the automated tools and techniques, we're also seeing vulnerabilities being introduced, not just far left of effect, but at scale. We've seen talks, there's been lots of discussions about automation and how that's going to increase the rate at which certain strains of malware are developed and deployed. I highlight ransomware as an example where we can spit out encrypted. There was a talk this morning, the plenary talked about ransomware. Ransomware is on the rise. It has been for a while, and here are some examples of those. I'm sure we all are familiar with ransomware, but just to go over it again. Actually, another interesting fact, the Australian healthcare sector throughout 2021 and 2022 was hit with huge ransomware attacks across the country affecting their healthcare sector, which was, you may have already heard of those. That was news to me because I wasn't monitoring that. An interesting, it was all the buzz when I went down and gave this talk there. But really the thesis of my talk is what I said before, which is that SBOMs, supply chain attacks, ransomware, the advent of automation are just new waves of technology and capabilities that are coming about due to or in response to these types of vulnerabilities and the actions that these actors are taking. But there's nothing really in particular special about them. My thesis is that for these two examples and all other examples of technology that we will use and implement and develop in order to tackle the newest trend in cybersecurity, we are never going to do as well as we could if our underlying data operations and what we do with our data and how we think about data isn't as good as it could be. So we really have to focus on these really core fundamentals of data science in order to get the most out of these tools and techniques. So that's basically what I'm going to be talking about today. So first, we're going to hit supply chain vulnerabilities. All right, so we're all familiar with SBOMs. That's good. But in case some of the folks who walked in aren't, this is the actual definition. So it's formal, machine-readable inventory of software components or dependencies, has information about these components and their hierarchical relationships. Now, since none of us, with maybe one exception, are actually using them, it's logical to ask, what are they used for? Well, since nobody is using them, I'm actually going to say, and I knew that would happen, what should they be used for? There was actually an article published by a really good friend of mine, Amelie Coran, out of the Atlantic Council, where she does a really big and deep treatment of SBOMs. And she outlines, just as an example article in her paper, she outlines 4 really important use cases for these documents. The procurement, you can use SBOMs to make informed decisions about software that you're going to buy or that you're going to integrate into your workflows. Vulnerability management, threat intelligence, the 2 that I'm kind of going to touch on today are incident response and ecosystem mapping, and she outlines a few more in her talk. But there on the right side is one example from SPDX of basically the general structure that one of these things is to take. And if you can tell, there's actually not a whole lot of information in that document. If you've worked with them, if you have seen them, if you've looked at them, they're pretty bare bones. They're meant to be machine readable, not necessarily human readable. So there's that. But for these documents, because they are machine readable, not human readable, they're really bare bones, like I said, the hard truth, the unfortunate truth, is that no set of SBOMs, no matter how big of a set we get for every piece of software we have in our organization, no set of those is going to tell us anything about our organizational risk by themselves. We have to actually put in a lot of work to get meaningful information and intelligence out of these things. And this is where the data operations actually comes in. So in some other talks, I think there was a talk earlier talking about the important context of data and your cyber operations. The context here is very, very, very important. I think context is important in everything that we do. But a reminder is that services, products, things that our organization, that your organization provides to others, those are all dependent on software components. That's one of the reasons we have SBOMs. We study supply chain vulnerabilities now, and it's one reason why bad actors want to take advantage of supply chain, is because they are so critical to our operations. So some of the questions that you might be able to eventually answer with these bills of materials are: where is your organization most vulnerable? What impacts would a vulnerability have on the services and products that I provide? And can these risks be quantified? So one way that you might do this is, let's say, for an example, that your organization provides a service monitoring capability. Like a Datadog comes to mind as, you have a process running and you want to know information about it. Let's just say you provide that capability, that you monitor a service and you give your end users information about that service. Now, that capability that you are so important for is built upon applications that you have developed to serve your product, right? So you may have, this is the most simple example in the world, but your service monitoring capability might be built upon a Python application that your devs have worked really, really hard on. It may also be dependent on a logging service that logs all of that information and then later goes on to surface it for the end users. And then those applications all the way down are built upon software and software components. So your Python application uses packages, you're going to pip install those, you're going to run with those. Your logging service has some logging software that might be developed in a completely different language. And what you can kind of start to see here is a dependency tree. So at the very, very top, we have all the services and really important capabilities that our organization provides. So like, as an analogy, you might think of like your water treatment facility provides really critical clean drinking water to serve the entire organization or your entire company or country, region, whatever. But their ability to provide that service depends on the people at the plant. It depends on the equipment at the plant. It depends on, all the way down to the very fine ICS SCADA devices, the firmware, and all of that. Is anyone in the room familiar with the JARM 10-layer model? Okay, you should Google that. In this picture, this is the most simple picture in the world. There are 3 layers, but you can actually go even further down to hardware components. You can intermix other layers in between. You don't just go necessarily straight from applications to capability. You can make this as complicated as you want. The point is that down here at the very bottom is where those SBOMs live. So the elements of the software that you're working with, the individual components, all are kind of at this bottom layer that feed up, percolate up to those very important capabilities. Mathematically, I already said this is kind of a dependency. As a mathematician, I have to point out that these are network structures that can be measured, that can be studied, that can be modeled. And if you start building these for your organization, that gives you a source of data and insight for your organization as you run through incident response plans, as you run through, analysis of your processes, analysis of the decisions you make, that can give you a source of data that you can point to and say, hey, this data here, from which I built this dependency tree, is actual real data from your organization. I have the SBOMs to prove it. We did all these interviews. We built this dependency tree. So then at the end, when you start asking questions about what happened, we walked through this exercise, we took out this water treatment plant or whatever, we took out this logging service, and you lost that capability, what changes should we make in order to ensure that we do not lose a capability in the event of a supply chain attack or something similar. Now, I say all of that to say, I'm realizing I'm going really fast, so I'm going to try to slow down. I get excited. Okay, great. Okay, great. They were like 40 minutes, and I'm like, it's going to be 20 minutes for me. Yes?
Spell the model you said to look up. Well, how's that spelled?
It's JARM. Yeah. Yeah. So that's a really interesting model that's used to model network and cyber dependencies. It could give you some interesting insight into how to build these. Now again, trying to talk a little bit more slowly. I say all of this to say that what I just said is easy to say. This is harder in practice to do. Organizations are not simple 3-layer models. Organizations are not simple services, one single service. They're not built on single Python applications. Maybe some companies are, but most companies are not. They're not built on single software packages. Building these out for an entire organization takes time, it takes money, and it takes buy-in from people who are really interested in building the mathematical models you can use to explore these dependencies. So this is what I'm talking about when I say work is required, and why a lot of people haven't actually taken these steps yet. There are baby steps that we can take to get to a point where our large organizations actually are starting to think in this way and actually implement these things. The first is that you don't have to model your entire organization. We do this for our people. We have org charts. We don't necessarily tie the org charts to every individual piece or action or capability that a person serves at the organization, but we can. So that's one piece of this. People are an important piece of cybersecurity, element of cybersecurity. You can start small. Maybe model an individual team or one component that you think you'd like to study more. You don't have to do everything all at once. But before you start doing that, or as you take steps to start doing that, there are things that you can do to build towards those models and those processes. So invest in red teaming your processes. I'm a big people process person. I am a systems thinker. So I'm not, I work at Tenable, but I'm not down here writing NASL code. I'm up here thinking, how are we gathering data? How are we using it? What organizations are talking to each other? I think we need to spend more time red teaming people and processes than actual components, cybersecurity things. And even if you are going to red team, pieces of software or whatever, you really should take the time to red team how those pieces of software affect the people and the processes that you undertake at your organization. So if you take one takeaway from this section of the talk, please invest in red teaming your processes, because those processes are the steps by which your people at your organization take to make the important decisions for how they respond to these things. We have to be diligent and deliberate with respect to the data we collect and log about our internal processes. So I mentioned on the previous slide, we have these logging services or whatever, but understanding how individual applications and pieces of software are critical to everything that the organization does isn't necessarily something that you can just get out of GitHub. You're going to have to actually sit down and talk to people and understand who they talk to, whether they're really critical and important to a procedure, to something that your organization does, or going back to the process piece. We have to actually take the time to log almost metadata about our organization, and I just don't think we're doing that. And then I've said it with red teaming a little bit, but using SBOMs and dependency modeling to inform your exercises and playbooks and run-throughs. Like I said, SBOMs really could be a great source of truth and data that you can point to, get everybody on the same page and say, here's the SBOM that I was given for the piece of software that you're actually using. You agree that you're using it and you're using it for ABC. Yes. Okay, so now we've agreed on our baseline assumptions. When I implement a plan, we test something out, we red team, and we see the impacts. Well, we've agreed on our baseline assumptions. So these impacts really are real and can be measured. Yeah?
Sorry, but do you have you said that previous slide is a little high level. Do you have a practical example of what this would look like for an organization, like an example process?
So in this example, I have, for example, I have the capability, the applications, and the software, but you can have a people layer and you can have information layers. So if you have people or approval processes, so here's me, and I may be critical to an approval process for purchasing at my organization, but the person who is making the decision to purchase has to go through me to get that approval. So in my people layer, I have, here's the manager, here's my manager decision maker layer, here's my, subordinate layer. The information that's being passed between the layer is not only information about that purchasing agreement, but it's information about the approval. So one way to model those processes is to actually, honest to goodness, put people and the edges between your people, here I'm getting into graph theory land, the edges between your nodes in your network are that information, the approvals, the stamps, the requirements that have to be satisfied in order to proceed from one step of the process to the next. So when you build these out for large organization, or for an organization, it doesn't have to be a large organization, it almost becomes a social network because you have information being passed from one person, one organization to the next. You can make it as big or as fine-tuned as possible or as you want. You may have a node that represents a team, and within that team are other nodes, or you may have nodes that have attributes of what teams they belong to and what types of approvals they pass. So I'm always in graph theory land, and that is what that would look like to me and what it has looked like for me in practice. Does that answer your question? No. Okay.
That's okay. 'Cause right now it's this big abstract concept, and I just want to know if I want to take this into a company and say, hey, I heard this cool talk about understanding our whole flow of everything. How do I make that practical? Do you have an example of that for a service monitoring, what that really trickles down to all these different layers?
Yeah, so what I just described is basically what that does look like. What the process of implementing it is it's resource intensive. It involves talking to a lot of people because you have to understand who person A talks to, what pieces of software they use to get all of that done. In instances where I've accomplished this in the past, it is months and months long for the scales that we're doing. But for small teams, it's a whole lot easier. When I've done this in the past, it's been huge organizations, like military organizations. Yeah. So, okay, 1 second. Hold on. He beat you. Yeah.
So how do you do this dynamically? And organizations, the people change, the processes change, and obviously software changes itself. But even the people part of it changes. So how do you keep it dynamic? As that changes, and is there software that you use to do this?
I don't work at the Applied Physics Lab anymore. Okay. But when we were at the Applied Physics Lab, we actually did develop a proprietary system for doing this. There is a paper in open source that you can read about. It's called Dagger, is what the software is called. We used it to do these very things, and you can but all Dagger is, the DAG in Dagger stands for Directed Acyclic Graph. There's nothing preventing you from, in a computer, using Python or your favorite graph theory code of choice, to implement a dynamic, time-dependent, directed acyclic graph where the nodes, the edges change depending on actions you take on that graph model. Mathematically, that's how, and computer scientifically, that's how you would implement this. So if you want, you can even set it up to be Monte Carlo and random, seeded randomly, right? So let's say I have a model of all the people in my organization, and here they are talking to each other, and I want a change to be made. Let's say someone unexpectedly, really sadly, tragically passes away or something, just as an example. I could seed that in the algorithm, implement that change in my graph model, and then have people respond to that. how would the organization handle that? How would the organization change? Would we restructure? Is that person important enough that we would have to go through an entire restructuring? So implementing models like that are data-driven, using things like these SBOMs, are really important to driving those important conversations about the people, the processes at the seams of your organization, right? So that would be how I would do that. Does that answer your question? Yes. All right, 1 for 2.
I don't know, I might be an obvious kind of statement, but as much as it's pointing out what's needed to be done, it's also a vulnerability that they're also protecting. Be very careful about who's getting this information.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Because everybody, you hear about it, nobody's talking about making sure that this whole process is completely secure, because it's the open door.
Yeah, no, absolutely, totally agree. I mean, you're pointing out the obvious, but the obvious needs to be said.
That's why they're making it possible, because it's not doing that.
Yeah, right. And how they exist and no one's using them. Yay. Slowly, we'll get there. It's because this is what it takes to do useful intelligence and actually do things with these. No one wants to invest in this. I get it. Everything I just talked about, spending months developing graph models, actionable pieces of intelligence using these, is a huge investment. I get it. That's part of what I'm trying to say, is that we're not there yet. So don't walk away from this talk being like, soft supply chain, guys, we did it, got SBOMs. No, not at all. We're not there yet. Yes. 5 maybe? I don't know. I don't think we're close. We got a long way to go. So like 4. Yes.
What, if any, in relation to, because like some organizations are starting to adopt service catalog and are more granular and automatic. So I'm wondering if anything that's like in terms of SBOM. So I'm kind of looking at it from the application side of service catalog, like what we have there, what are the dependencies, things like that. But in terms of like SBOM is like for the whole thing, yeah, it's a lot of work and it's still to go, but it's like, right, at least we can find out what the power goes in on that of our services, that whole thing.
Yeah.
So, but it's a 10-minute model, like we still have to work on that beyond for the long, but to the dynamic issue of, come and go, services change, things like that, once you have to start. I'm just curious if across the SBOM usage like that, across service catalogs, how they can better.
So I haven't. That's not an area of research that I've dug really deep into, but I mean, you raise a really good question. I just don't know. Yeah. Oh, okay. Yes.
So how does this play into the national cybersecurity strategy and where they're actually recommending SBOMs? And the second part is business continuity and resiliency planning from a people perspective. We've done this in BCP DR on a people and process level, but not on a software level.
2 really good questions. So the first one is about the national cybersecurity strategy. I was very disappointed in the national cybersecurity strategy because there weren't any actionable steps. I thought yeah, right. And I don't think it gave us any more guidance than we already have about how to actually use these things, which is why I'm out here talking about this, because these are steps we need to take. And I talk about policy a little bit later, but there are concrete steps that we need to actually start taking to get people to that level of readiness and preparedness and protection. But although they technically are a piece of the national cybersecurity strategy, I don't think the national cybersecurity strategy goes far enough in telling people what to actually do with them. And then, I'm sorry, your second question was?
Business continuity and resiliency planning already handles something similar on the people and process side, but not on the technology side. Yes,
right. So in cases where I have done this type of modeling in the past, the business continuity strategy have played an important part to that, because a lot of teams and organizations already have business continuity strategies and plans, and it is important when we do this modeling that we push those hard, which is why I'm saying red team processes. Those resiliency plans need to be revisited. They need to be tested across all kinds of cases, edge cases, events, what have you. And I don't know in my personal experience that I have come across an organization yet who is actually doing that as much as they need to, which is why I'm up here preaching people and process. Yes. Okay.
So is this mostly like a military government thing right now and hasn't really reached the private sector? Do you think that that's accurate?
So because of the work that I did at APL, I will say that my experience with these has been government and DoD. So I've only worked at Tenable since May. And my exposure to the private sector, both prior to working at Tenable and now, is that these don't exist, that this modeling is not there. Yep.
I think I understand why my question was confusing. You said like you've worked on a couple of these now. Can you show us like the core like end output or artifact where you're like, now based on this graph, we have a better understanding of this capability? Do you have that?
I do not. And but I can tell you what it looks like, and it is a pretty boring list of recommendations. That's basically what it looks like. But they're lists of recommendations that are data-driven, that are informed by a model that is based on their actual data. So these people, because they've agreed on the assumptions of the model, get to a point where they're like, I get this, you're right, I believe you. Yeah. So it's usually a list of concrete recommendations. And I'll tell you this, while I was at APL, the other thing that I worked on was a project called IARPA Focus. And that was a project run by IARPA, meant to study how good people are at counterfactual analysis. If you don't know what counterfactual analysis is, that is asking what if questions and trying to measure the outcome. So like Man in the High Castle, what if World War II had turned out different, or such and such, how would history have changed? And it turns out people are extremely bad at counterfactual analysis. We're just not good, especially when it comes to policy and a lot of abstract concepts. So I say this because it's easy in an after action report to say, well, if that had happened, I would have done this. Would you? It's like that Instagram reel meme that's going around now that's like, you sure about that? You sure about that? But when you have a model of your people and processes, you can actually show them and put them in that scenario and say, now let's assume you made that decision or you didn't make that decision. How would the outcomes have been? And put them in those positions and force them to actually make that decision and defend it. And that's where people start to learn. That's where that comes out, and they start to actually reflect on that reasoning that they were partaking in, if that makes sense. But that was a long rambling answer to come back to say, sometimes the recommendations are these like counterfactual things where we can go back and actually make changes and then say, here's what you should have done, or here's what you could have done, or here's the lessons learned from this entire procedure. Sometimes they're actual concrete recommendations for change. Yes.
So I'm trying to wrap my head around this a bit. So it looks like you need a combination of things in order to get to a place where you can actually even implement a model like this, because you need observability across your entire environment, whether that is infrastructure, cloud services, cloud applications, on-premises applications. And then you need your business impact analysis to identify your critical services, right? And services, processes, and people, right? And then you also have to capture all of the shadow IT that exists within your organization that you have no observability on, because that's the definition of shadow IT.
Yep, it's a lot. But I will say, though, that sometimes in going through this process, if you don't have observability where you think you might need it, when you start going through these processes, that's when you discover that. It's like, man, I don't have observability in this. If I had it, look at all this cool stuff I could do, or look at all the information I could have. So just the discovery process of using these SBOMs thinking about the supply chain can lead to improvements in the observability. Now, for the shadow IT, that's a good example of a risk or a potential source of risk that is unknowable, which you highlighted. And a lot of times in models like this, in these graph models, these dependency diagrams, the best we can do is to Donald Rumsfeld it and say, this is a known unknown. We have unknown unknowns, known unknowns, and all of that. And you might not be able to exactly quantify what the effect of those risks are, but you may be able to get close. So one thing you might, for example, you might have one of these for like critical infrastructure, and you don't know what the weather is going to be like on any given day, but you know that the weather is a source of risk, right? So you can take a guess at what different, varieties of weather, what types of risk that might impose to the model, and have, a piece of randomness in your model that introduces that risk, and end up with probability distributions that you can use to upper and lower bound the risk to your organization. And for something as unknowable as like shadow IT, depending on the scale of the model, you may be able to do something similar like that and actually get ranges or probability distributions. It's definitely hard when you don't have all that insight.
Okay, so that's actually a great segue into my other thought is that, like, I didn't even know about observability before I started working for an observability company. And before that, I was working with Fortune 500 companies and many different IT teams and security teams. And so I was involved and engaged with a lot of different teams, and this never came up. Like, even the observability piece never really came up within like the security teams.
Because they'd have to address it.
And so what I'm saying is that, like, you have a whole bunch of different departments that are working in silos that have no idea and no insight into anything that's happening on the other side of the business, and you have to have that in order to get here.
So yes and no. So I would say that it depends. In some organizations, they're siloed for a reason. I tend to fall on the side of siloing is bad, but that's because of the teams and the organizations and groups that I've worked with and on before. But in some cases, the siloing can be good for like data governance or data production, just something simple like that. Maybe those teams really don't need to be talking to each other. It could be a source of conflict or, what have you. That to say, you raise a good point, and that's, I think, another example where going through a process like this, I was talking about organizing or modeling at the seams of your organization, and that's an example of that, where I would want to ask questions about the processes that would force those two teams to work together, or for that siloing to be a problem, make them work through it, and then highlight to them that this is a problem and we need to come up with a solution. Again, easier said than done. Okay, one more question. I still have half of a talk. This is way more popular than I thought it was going to be. This was actually, I thought this is the weakest half of my talk. So yes, okay.
So I was actually going in a two-part close. I apologize. Sorry for hijacking the whole thing.
No.
So I think I'm starting to unclear. Is this like a new function or abstraction of a risk management framework, where if you understand all of this, now you have a deeper understanding, you can measure and respond to risk in a better way? Is that what
I would say yes. I don't label it that way, but I would say yes, that it is in some ways a risk management framework or an enhancement on those. Yes. Okay. Okay. I'm not going to tell you no. Okay. Yeah.
It would be wrong to conflate, so I kind of asked about service account, it was like a very drilled out thing before, but would it be wrong to conflate this with risk-based dependency mapping?
Absolutely not. That is what this is.
All right, so given that, this is more like the superset of that concept.
Yes. You got it. Nailed it. Okay, now I'm going to go. Okay, this was all I was going to say else, which is just a summary that all of this takes effort. We've talked about that. Okay, so how many of you were in the talk that just happened in here? Okay, for the 3 or 4 of you, this is going to be a little repetitive, but for all the rest of you who maybe were standing in a line outside and couldn't get in, this will be great. Okay, so this actually is a topic that is very near and dear to my heart. I'm not an expert in AI machine learning. I'm a mathematician who understands kind of how they work under the hood. I have worked some machine learning for SOC before to help them better prioritize the tickets that they should go through, but that was a long time ago. The systems thinking and the critical thinking about data is really what drives my investigation and thoughts into this. Okay, so this actually is, the last talk talked about downsides, the bad of ChatGPT. Now, when I say AI, I don't want you to think just ChatGPT. AI is, like the previous speaker highlighted, an entire huge field that's just so much more than ChatGPT. This is an article from MIT Tech Review. When I was at APL, I worked on a thing called the COVID-19 Decision Support Center. We were deep into COVID-19. This article came out in July 30th of 2021, and it's from MIT Tech Review, and it actually was a survey, or was a study of a survey, basically a summarization of a survey conducted by the British Medical Journal on AI and machine learning tools that were built or constructed to help diagnose COVID patients and predict their outcomes. And unfortunately, the findings were not very good. So if you think about the COVID-19 situation, we had tons of data about millions of people. A lot of researchers said, oh my gosh, this is great. I'm going to jump in. I'm going to get the data. I'm going to do my best to develop an AI algorithm for good. And in haste, a lot of bad things happened. So in this article, in the highlighted yellow part, you can see the British Medical Journal analyzed 232 algorithms for diagnosing patients or predicting how sick those with the disease might get. And they found that none of them were fit for clinical use. For some definition of clinical use that's highlighted in the article, but you can just think of it as a doctor would use it. Not a single one of them. Only 2 were singled out as being promising enough for future testing. The biggest reason that they highlighted for why a lot of these AI machine learning tools actually failed were the poor quality of the data. And here is my thesis in bright yellow. One example was a AI algorithm or a machine learning classifier that was built to classify X-ray or CT scan images of COVID patients. And what they actually found were that the AI was classifying patients whose images were taken while they were sitting upright as healthy or had better outcomes, and images of patients who were laying down were more likely to be severely ill. Well, no, duh. Because if the person can't even sit up in the CT scanner or the X-ray machine, they're more likely to be severely ill. So because a lot of those tags hadn't been cleared out of the data, that was actually what the algorithm learned to associate. In another example, the larger hospitals were found to have better COVID-19 outcomes because all of the data that were coming out of systems from those hospitals were standardized. They use things like Epic, which take in large amounts of data and can export nice CSVs and stuff, whereas smaller hospitals were entering their data manually. There were more errors. A lot of data had to be excluded, and those systems, those data products were not cleaned and pre-processed before they were fed into the algorithm. So there was less data from these smaller hospitals, not just because they were smaller, but because they were having to throw out so much data because the quality was bad. This is scary. I don't like this. Another example, if you've seen the John Oliver show, John Oliver used this one. I gave this talk before John Oliver did, so I think he stole from me. I'm just saying. The self-driving Uber that hit and killed a woman did not recognize that pedestrians jaywalk. So I brought this example up to an AI researcher at Johns Hopkins, and he said, well, but the sensors are LiDAR or whatever, and they're not going to detect, she wasn't wearing bright clothing, and so they're not going to see her. And I'm like, that's beside the point. That's very tragic and sad. And they should be using sensors that can see people wearing dark clothing. That's beside the point. What's in the subcontext there is what I want to highlight. The automated car lacked the ability to classify an object as a pedestrian unless that object was near a crosswalk. They never used data that showed people crossing streets not in crosswalks. Y'all live in New York City.
Yeah, crazy. They did that in California, that's why.
Right, yeah, probably. Actually, I know the accident. Yeah. Right. So this is just another example of poor data practices that have led to a really tragic outcome. Okay. This example was highlighted in the previous talk. This one is very near and dear to my heart because my husband actually works on the data pipeline for the James Webb Space Telescope. So yeah, fantastic. I'm so proud of him. He's way smarter than I am. But when this happened, everybody in my household was offended because Google put out this very easy demonstration of what their BARD capability could do. They asked it a very simple, hey, can you summarize a few cool findings from the James Webb Space Telescope? Like the third one was incorrect. All Google had to do was Google it, and they published it, and it cost them $100 billion. Their stock tanked because their AI model that was supposed to come out in response to ChatGPT or whatever couldn't even get a basic fact-finding mission right. And the scarier part to me, though, is that no one at Google Googled it. The marketing team put it out. I'm sorry if you work at Google. I'm really sorry, but come on, y'all. And okay, so this one is also one of my favorite examples. This is a very early image. You might say, oh, but Jessie, the data from like self-driving cars and COVID, that's really complicated data. One of the first things that machine learning models were invented for was image classification. Image classification is easy. Everybody knows of the digits data set where people draw digits and you classify the digits. Okay, well, this is from a math paper. It's really hard for you to see, but I'll read it to you. It's okay. On the left is the image that the machine learning algorithm correctly classified as a Bernese Mountain Dog with 73% confidence that it's a Bernese Mountain Dog. It looks like it could be a couple other dog breeds, but it got that part right. On the right, you can't tell because of the quality of the image in the projector, but that image has been perturbed by noise, a very strategically chosen noise pattern that's been overlaid onto the image that I can't see because I'm a human, but a machine was tricked into classifying that dog as a golf cart. And it's actually more confident that that's a golf cart than it ever was. It was a Bernese Mountain Dog. It says that that's 98.9% confident that that's a golf cart. We're not out of a job yet. Yes. So this is another example of something I want to highlight. This is an article on practical attacks in machine learning systems. We're going to be implementing machine learning and AI tools into our cybersecurity stack, or for doing whatever it is, diagnosing people. And if someone can figure out what we're using it for, what our training data looks like, can they not reverse engineer something to trick it into doing something that we didn't intend it to do? There are already papers out there about reverse engineering GPT-style training data sets and figuring out what data was used to train them. Okay. I have like 5 minutes left, so I'm going to go really, really fast through this part. I don't want to scare you away. Machine learning and AI, we've heard talks. This morning we talked about ChatGPT being really cool and effective. This paper was published by a guy I worked with at Oak Ridge National Lab, actually showed that when they integrate a machine learning-based malware detector into their cybersecurity operations, they could study how well it did, and it actually did good. Okay, you can read the actual paper if you want. There's a citation. I'm happy to share my slides. So to me, this creates a really scary scenario where we're implementing these tools that work, that are good for us, that are helpful, that we don't understand. And that's like a perfect storm. And that's what I don't want to happen to us. There's no policies. The previous speaker talked about this. I'm glad that he did. There's no policies mandating minimal effectiveness or transparency. We have no idea how they work. OpenAI won't tell us what data they use to train it. Did anybody read the Washington Post article that came out literally 2 days ago where they actually studied hired a firm to look into the training data for Google C4 and Facebook's Llama algorithm. Has anybody even looked at any of that training data?
Are you talking about how the, like, every third answer was, like, racist?
No. So this is a little different. That's also scary, very scary. So how many of you guys have used like a GPT or ChatGPT, looked into it? And not a single one of you have looked at the training
Well,
data?
but the source of the data sets, when they opened it up, is very different from when it's closed. And knowing that it's based on a particular set, I'm aware of it, but I haven't looked at the set.
Right.
We know that it's.
Well, so did you know that the training data used for the Google C4 training data that they use for Bard and then the Facebook data set, one of the top 100 sources they use to generate tokens is the entire voter registration of the United States? Now, what can that be used for? That came out 2 days ago in the Washington Post. Like, that terrifies me. That is really scary. Okay, I have 2 minutes. Okay, and then I talk about lawmakers. We talked about this in the previous talk, but there's no policies out here. Policies evolving. It's catching up. I think there's going to be a lot of changes. I think the EU is probably going to lead the way. I think they're mandating privacy laws for data. I think they're going to also do that for AI algorithms. I think that's coming. I think that's good. This is a paper I published on ways that we can actually use clinical trial. There's no excuse for this. We can be transparent. We can test these things. We have clinical trial structures to help us evaluate these things. No one uses them. And the bottom line is, in order to answer and solve these sexy problems, the data problems are really critical. We got to get our data stuff right. We got to solve these unsexy problems first and invest in these methodologies to get us where we need to be. Don't let your doggos become golf carts. Verification, traceability. The previous speaker talked big time about traceability. We have OpenAI made the joke about it being closed AI, and I like that joke because we have no idea what's going on under the hood. Even AI experts can't explain the black box. If you watch the John Oliver special, he talked about this too. Before you even start using ChatGPT or a GPT, have you assessed what that risk of using that tool is for your organization? Not just the ChatGPT, but any piece of technology. Do you have a process for evaluating this, and is it repeatable? Again, I'm a big people process person.
Team just decide that they were going to start using it without telling anyone in security.
Yeah.
That never happens.
Yeah, that never happened. So when I gave this talk in Australia, there weren't nearly as many questions because no one even knew what an SBOM was. And I had tons of time to go over this, and I know I'm basically out of time. But I'm just going to throw this up here as something that you can take a picture of. So this is my rules, how I think about, and actually I think Harvard Business School teaches this too, but whatever. I follow this. I subscribe to this. Not all data science is created equal. There's a difference between using your data to tell you what you know versus using it to help you understand what you know. Situational awareness versus situational understanding. They're two very different things. So take a picture of this. There's different types of questions. There are many steps that you can take to move between these levels. The blue box is an example of different types of questions that you can ask related to SBOMs. The purple is just like a cyber example of the different types of questions you can ask at each of these levels and how that relates to the maturity of your organization. But I don't have time to go over it. That's it.